Okay. So, on behalf of JFAS and Kent, I'm very excited that Kent offered to do this talk. He is a PhD in psychology at Rutgers University, Newark. He examines how psychosocial resources, for example, self-esteem and social support, affect the perceptions of threat. Very interesting how close, high, and large they are. He also studies interracial feedback from white instructors to learners of color, emotional disclosure and social judgment, fear of hope, and anti-Semitism. He received his doctorate in experimental social psych from Stanford, completed postdoctoral training in health behavior at WashU in St. Louis, and then worked for 2 years as a research assistant at American Institute for Research, where he focused on effective teaching. In 1999, he accepted his current position at Rutgers-Newark, yay, and he's been supported by the NSF, the Spencer Foundation, the NIH, the Schusterman Foundation, and the Academic Engagement Network. His work has been featured in the Atlantic, Newsweek, HuffPost, and other venues, and I think his work is very timely. So we've got a real treat in store. So I'm going to turn it over to Kent now.
Okay, Jackie, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to talk today. And thanks for everyone for being here. Okay, so as you see, my talk is anti-Semitism and attitudes towards Israel. And this is a team effort, and I'll get to that in a minute here. Now, why is Mr. PowerPoint not moving? Let's see if I can get do this one here. There we go. Okay. So here's an event that happened a number of years ago. Rutgers-Newark, I haven't now seen it for a while, but it's how it was called International Day that would feature, Rutgers-Newark prides itself on being a particularly diverse college campus. And they have these different, sort of tents featuring cultures of the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Asia. So I go to the Middle East tent, and there's flags lining the whole perimeter of the tent, but I can't find the Israeli flag. But I see a kind of conspicuous gap towards the back. I walk there, and this is what I see is the Israeli flag next to a trash can ripped down from its grommets. And I was alarmed. I was upset. I was angry um, as a Jew and as a Zionist. And then it occurred to me, maybe this was just an insult to me being someone who's pro-Israel, and that my Jewish part was exempt, which is basically gets to this fundamental question. Is hostility towards Israel, are hostility towards Israel and hostility towards Jews related, or are they really separate kinds of animosities? There's a theory called New Anti-Semitism, which proposes that to a significant degree, to a substantial degree, um, classic anti-Semitism, which cannot be, or with a nod towards Tucker Carlson, cannot be sort of politely expressed. There's a taboo on it, just as there's a taboo towards overt racism, taboo towards overt sexism. But it can go under a disguised version of being anti-Israel. So I got this phrase here, I'm not anti-Semitic, I just don't like Israel. There's a theory called modern racism, which is a kind of a parallel version. So another theory called modern feminism. They both have the same kind of reasoning, where a person can disguise their racism, their sexism by saying, I'm not racist or sexist, I just don't like affirmative action. Um, and this camouflage works because, and it's the point I really want to emphasize, people can be legitimately critical of Israel for any variety of reasons. Being critical of Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic. You can be angry at some of Israel's far-right politicians or at the members of militant settler movements and the mistreatment of West Bank Palestinians, or even within the Israeli Jewish society, the inequitable treatment of some of like the Ethiopian members. Any of those are legitimate criticisms. So that being the case, how do you distinguish what is fair from biased criticism of Israel? And Natan Sharansky has developed a here what he calls his 3D sort of diagnostic system: double standards, delegitimization, and demonization. If these are in evidence, then there's reason to believe that anti-Israel criticism goes from being legitimate to being bigoted. So what do you mean by double standards? Okay, here's one example. There's an international ranking called the Freedom Ranking, which looks at to what degree a society has an open judiciary, a free press, addresses civil liberties, open voting. And Israel, compared to Russia, Iran, Syria, it just dwarfs them in terms of how strong its freedom rating is. But then you look at UN condemnations as a percent, 2006 to 2024, Israel exceeds Russia, Iran, and Syria altogether. So the country which is the most liberal in the Middle East is the one most condemned. Another example, I just found this today. BBC News is considered the gold standard of international reporting. They have made some errors in the reporting of the Gaza war. Of those errors, 240 were anti-Israel. They themselves acknowledge. Those that are anti-Palestinian, zero. So one of the reasons this is important is that if people are taking the BBC News at face value, they might not catch these corrections. Okay. Then there's delegitimization, which is not saying that, I disagree with Israel, I don't like Israel. It's saying Israel should not exist. So here we see a protester in New York doing the kind of slash your throat sign. Another protester who is now lionizing not simply, innocent Palestinians who might be suffering because of the war, but those who perpetrated the war, Hamas leaders. Or I stand with Palestine with a symbol of a hang glider, which was what the Hamas terrorists used when they came in and murdered and raped and pillaged and maimed people. Or you see an emblem of Palestine in which Israel does no longer exist. It's wiped out. Or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. No more Israel. Okay, so that's an eliminationist attitude. And finally, there's demonization, which is not simply saying I have problems with particular Israelis or I don't like some of Israeli actions. It is transforming Israel and Israelis into signs of evil. So one of the most galling ones is equating Israelis with Nazis. And part is, doing so is saying, what is the worst of the worst expression of human evil, the Nazis? No difference between a Nazi and an Israeli. It also has the effect of negating the Jewish experience of the Holocaust by saying, well, you're no better than anybody else. The other is, and this is a classic anti-Semitic trope, of comparing Jews to, sort of creepy critters of spiders, pigs, an octopus. And in case you don't quite get what the symbolism here, we have a Jewish star and a Zionist Z. So in other words, there's not much difference. There's no light between them. Okay, so this new anti-Semitism theory and the forms that Anatoly Sharansky has developed has created a very, very robust opposition and is fairly clearly stated by Dylan Saba, who is the legal representative of Palestine Legal. He says the following: anti-Zionism is a political position distinct from anti-Semitism, which is a prejudice. The two are conflated by supporters of Israel to discredit critics, he says. This is important. He's not saying there's a confusion. He's saying that there is a weaponization of that accusation to silence and to shame those who are critical of Israel. Condemning Israel may make some Jewish students uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it anti-Semitic. Okay, well, this is not only a communication from someone who is an advocate for the Palestinian cause. Peter Beinart, very well known and actually a Jewish columnist, has this article in The Guardian debunking the myth that anti-Semitism is anti-Semitic. He says that, yes, he acknowledges that there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, but conflating it with anti-Zionism is, he says, a mistake. So the two are co-occurring, but there's just a coincidence. Just like, global warming is increasing and so are, action movies. There's no meaningful relation to them. They just happen to be happening at the same time. Brian Klug is this well-known social philosopher who's basically dedicated a big chunk of his current career and current fame to what he calls, exposing what he calls the myth of the new anti-Semitism. And he says that you could be absolutely fairly critical of Israel, or even excessively critical of Israel, but they're having no relation to anti-Semitism. As an example, a person could be vehemently anti-Nigeria, even unfairly anti-Nigeria, or vehemently anti-Venezuela and unfairly anti-Venezuela without being anti-Black or anti-Latino. You just don't like those countries. Happen to be hosts for Black people or Latino people. Same thing with Israel. So you think that after the Hamas attack, that and the rise of both anti-Israel protests and anti-Semitic occurrences that happened afterward, that there would be a muting, and there'd be a recognition that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are connected. Doesn't happen. We get in the Atlantic, don't equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Washington Post, anti-Zionism isn't the same. The New Yorker asks, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? So it could feel irritating to see this, but the fact it feels irritating doesn't make it invalid. If anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attitudes are not genuinely connected or minimally connected, then we could be guilty of what you see here in this cartoon of Netanyahu attacking an earnest Jeremy Corbyn, the labor leader, ex-labor leader who was booted for anti-Semitism. Let's put that aside for a second, of being anti-Semitic just because he's standing up for Palestinian rights. Anti-Semite, he's shouting while firing defamation missiles at his back. Okay, well, we don't want to be that person. If there really is no strong connection, we need to know that there isn't and acknowledge it. On the other hand, if there is a meaningful connection, then the sort of tsunami of anti-Israel protests and sentiment could be a masking or it could be a variant of the anti-Semitism, which has been our historic legacy. So one main goal, maybe the central goal of the project I'm going to be talking about this evening, is whether or not that there is a connection, a meaningful connection between anti-Semitism and being hostile to Israel. We also want to see whether or not anti-Semitism predicts being anti-Israel, meaning if I know what a person's attitudes are towards Israel today, does that give me a good clue of what their feelings towards Israel will be in a week or a month? Prediction, and I'll explain why that's important in a bit. And then finally, do conspiracy theories connect anti-Semitism to anti-Israel attitudes? That's going to emerge in the coming slides. So we're not the first. My team is not the first to address this question. There's been a number of studies going back, for a ways now, nearly 2 decades, to see whether or not there is a correlation, simple correlation between anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Israel attitudes. And what you see in these studies is that all these are highly significant, and they range from the lowest correlation, 0.18, which should be right around here, to all the way up to 0.65, which should be up here. Correlation is just a measure of association, how much one thing co-occurs with another thing. One of the only a perfect correlation is one that in nature, the perfect correlation will be breathing. Inhalation and exhalation are perfectly correlated. Few things in life are otherwise perfectly correlated. A correlation of 0.44 is moderately strong. It's a credible correlation. Okay. And to put it in some perspective, that correlation is emblematic of what we're of the modern anti-Semitism theory. And in comparison to modern modern anti-racism, modern anti-feminism, it's stronger than anti-racism. It's on par with anti-feminism. The point I'm making is that these are well-established, well-respected theories of prejudice. The anti-Semitism, anti-Israel correlation is as strong or stronger than these other established demonstrations. Okay, but we want in our research to go beyond simple correlation. We want to see whether or not anti-Semitism predicts anti-Israel attitudes. Does anti-Semitism noted or identified at time one, does that predict an anti-Israel view weeks later? And there's reasons why showing prediction is important. One is it indicates that these two attitudes are very stable, that the relation between them is very strong. Correlation can sometimes reflect just a transitory event. So Jeremy Epstein has been a lot in the news. He's this infamous Jewish financier. His story is a pretty ugly one. It could be that hearing about this unfortunate Jewish character Epstein creates hostility to all things Jewish, to Jews, to Israel, anything Jewish. But once the story, moves on, so will the anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel attitudes. It's just a transitory event. If the relation is predictive, that means it is enduring over time, therefore much more stable. The other thing is that prediction permits forecasting. So do Jewish cultural events predict future anti-Israel protests on the date that these events are going to occur? Well, any of you who've been to synagogue lately know that they have high security on the Jewish high holidays, having nothing to do with Israel. But the concern is that they will become targets because of the association. And so they're predicting that a current, a calendared event will lead to, having to do with Jews, will lead to something about Israel later on. There was a very interesting study that looked at this predictive relationship done by Binstock et al. This was done in Britain, and they looked at the schedule of a football team called the Tottenham Hotspurs, or the Spurs. The Spurs are known as a Jewish team because in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Tottenham had a large Jewish population, and a lot of their fan base was Jewish. This is no longer the case. Tottenham has a much smaller Jewish population, but the fans refer to themselves as the Yid Army. When they play against opposing teams, the opposing fans make a hissing sound to simulate the gas chamber. This is part of the fun of being at a British football game. What Binstock and his team did is that they looked at the calendar for when Tottenham was playing some other team, and what they found was on the dates that these games actually occurred, there was a boost of anti-Israel tweets. And then that boost went away once the game was over. Well, if there's no association between Jews, which are associated with the Spurs, and anti-Semitism, it's hard to explain why you could predict anti-Israel tweets from a so-called Jewish team's schedule. So now I'm going to get finally to my team's research. And this is 3 sets of studies. All of them were done with a general population that we recruited online on a website called Prolific, all done with American samples. As you can see, they have relatively large samples. The average age was sort of representative of the general population, basically demographically diverse, and we had a good representation across the political spectrum. Study one was longitudinal, meaning we measured anti-Semitism as well as anti-Israel at time one, and also 7 weeks later. Study two was called cross-sectional. We did all of it at the same time. We did that to test an outcome that emerged unexpectedly from study one. The study three was also longitudinal, 3 time points separated by 4 weeks to see if we could predictively confirm what we found in studies 1 and 2. So that's our whole program. These are the measures we use. They're very basic. So one is this classic measure of anti-Semitism by Selznick and Steinberg from 1968. This is sort of a Chevy of measures. It's not flashy. It's very obvious. There's nothing subtle about it. Jews use shady practices to get what they want. You can usually identify Jews by their looks. Someone wants to get in here. Sorry, this person here. I can't get to him. Someone waiting to come in. Good. Okay. Jews have too much influence in government. Jews make too much of being oppressed. The point is, all these are about Jews. They have nothing to do with Israel. Then to get people's attitudes towards Israel, we used a component of the Middle East Opinion Survey, something that I've developed. There's a pro-Israel and anti-Israel scale. We use the anti-Israel scale. And sample items. Israel is the main reason for troubles in the Middle East. Zionism equals racism. Israel is just another version of white people dominating others. Support for Israel is cover for hostility to Jews. These are all not simply critical, but actually antagonistic and harsh statements about Israel. And they have nothing to do with Jews. So the point is, this is a measure about Jews unrelated to Israel. This is a measure of Israel unrelated to Jews. Do they correlate with each other? So our first study, we wanted to see whether or not anti-Semitism at time 1 would predict anti-Israel attitudes at time 2. The correlation is near zero. It's a bust. We were expecting it to be significant, and it wasn't. So maybe this predictive relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel is not there. Well, we took this a bit further. We also collected a number of conspiracy beliefs. Certain influential groups are linked to the current crisis in the Middle East. There are claims that Israel overlooked signs of Hamas attack to garner international sympathy. In other words, Israel wanted the Hamas attack to occur. Israel is accused of targeting civilians to encourage their departure from Gaza. It is suggested that Israel sought the conflict with Hamas to instigate a broader war between US and Iran. So we looked at how much people endorsed these as valid claims, these conspiracy theories. And what we found is a very interesting connection. Anti-Semitism at time 1 was strongly related to these conspiracy beliefs at time 2, which are themselves correlated with anti-Israel beliefs at time 2. What this is suggesting is that there is a connection from anti-Semitism to anti-Israelism, but the bridging element are conspiracy beliefs. Well, this should not have been any surprise for us. Conspiracy beliefs have saturated every sort of horrid event that have befallen the Jewish people, starting probably most early and most perniciously, the idea that Jews are responsible for Christ's crucifixion. Jews were held responsible for the Black Plague. Jews were held responsible for France's defeat by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. The readiness of people to hold Jews responsible for bad or evil deeds was used by the Tsarist Russia at the turn of the century to stave off the growing unrest. And they had the Tsarist secret police generated this fallacy called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It is horrible confabulation that Jews are secretly out to control governments, control finances, control the media, all for world domination. So this nasty tract became popularized by Henry Ford. He had it distributed through his news channels to those who worked in his factories, and it became influential for the Nazis, and it's currently very popularized throughout the Arab world. Okay. Well, these conspiracy beliefs are not just sort of an artifact of history. Jews have been held responsible, and Israel has been held responsible for the World Trade Center attacks, 2001 and the earlier one, for the COVID pandemic, for natural disasters, Hurricane Helene and the California wildfires of 2024. I mean, we've been busy. So you've got to wonder what kind of humans would be so dedicated to committing so many diabolical deeds. Well, according to the theorist David Eckies, it's not humans at all. In fact, Jews are an out of space or lizard people from another planet who shapeshift to look like Jews. So you think, who would ever believe something as silly as that? Well, Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, is one of his endorsers. Okay. So we've then decided that we would more systematically look at the role of conspiracy beliefs and to see to what degree they help explain the association between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attitudes. And we developed 3 sets. One had to do with conspiracy beliefs that solely target Israel. So Israel's COVID policy was designed to weaken Palestinians. Israel seeks to destroy Gaza to bring forth the Jewish Messiah. Then we had those that were anti-Zionist, Jews who are operating in Israel's behalf. So Jewish groups are attacking college presidents to increase support for Israel. Pro-Israel lobbies are gathering embarrassing information to blackmail politicians. There are Jewish students complain about campus anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel. And then we had the third group, which was anti-Jewish conspiracies that have nothing to do with Israel, but just Jews doing nefarious things to help Jews. So Jewish-owned drug companies manipulated COVID for financial gain. Jews use hiring practices designed to keep other groups down. Jews contribute to social justice causes to disguise their own power agendas. So these are Jews doing nasty things unrelated to Zionism, unrelated to Israel. And in our study too, this was all now done at one time. This was not a predictive study. It was just designed to see whether or not this, what we now call the conspiracies mediated model of anti-Semitism, is valid. And I'll walk you through this. So we looked at anti-Semitism at time 1. How much, sorry, this is all at the same time, my mistake. We looked at how much anti-Semitism was correlated to anti-Israel conspiracies. It was, and they were correlated to anti-Israel attitudes. Anti-Semitism was correlated to anti-Zionist conspiracies, also correlated to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was correlated to anti-Jewish conspiracies, but anti-Jewish conspiracies themselves had no relation to anti-Israel. I can go into this a little bit further if people have questions. We think this might be a statistical artifact, but the main point is that just as we found in the first study, there was a very strong association from anti-Semitism to anti-Israel. The total effect, that's from here to here, is very, very strong. But it's strong because of the role of conspiracy beliefs. If you take away the role of conspiracy beliefs, the direct effect goes to near zero, meaning that these conspiracy beliefs are a very powerful mediator. They are bridging the connection from anti-Semitism to anti-Israel attitudes. So now we wanted to see whether or not this, what we're calling the conspiracies mediated model of anti-Semitism, can be demonstrated in a predictive way. Does anti-Semitism at time 1 predict conspiracy beliefs time 2, 4 weeks later? And does that predict anti-Israel attitudes 4 weeks after that? This is a kind of a very probably daunting looking figure, but I'll walk you through it. Just as in study 2, anti-Semitism at time 1 is related to anti-Israel conspiracies at time 2, anti-Zionist conspiracies, and anti-Jewish conspiracies at time 2, but only anti-Israel conspiracies and anti-Zionist conspiracies are correlated with, predict anti-Israel attitudes at time 3. What we're showing is that you can predict anti-Semitism at time 1 to anti-Israel attitudes 8 weeks later, but you can do that because of the linking role of these conspiracy beliefs. Anti-Jewish conspiracies, in fact, were, if anything, negatively related. So it's really anti-Israel, anti-Zionist conspiracy beliefs. Okay, I'm going to get into something that's going to look like a statistical getting into the weeds, but this is important. There's a statistic, a way of addressing a model, which is called model fit. How well does the model actually, how fit the data, or how well do the data you collected fit your hypothesized theoretical model? Well, if you have good fit, it means that the variables that you're looking at, anti-Semitism, conspiracy beliefs, anti-Islam, they are doing a pretty good job of explaining everything that's going on. You don't need to add anything more. Adding anything more will be superfluous or maybe even hurt it. But there could be, if you have bad fit, then you can have these relations between the variables you think are important, but they're not explaining what's going on. Maybe what's really going on is that there are people who are isolationists tend to be conspiratorial minded and racist, in which case people who are isolationists have these conspiracy beliefs about Jews, and they don't like anything related to Jews. They also have conspiracy beliefs about other kinds of, about immigrants. So they don't like Latinos, and they're anti-immigration. If that's the true model, then what we're predicting is off base. The true model could be isolationism is just leading to all kinds of nasty, racist and prejudicial behavior. It's not unique to anti-Semitism and anti-Israel. Well, it turns out there are ways of assessing how good your model is. And I won't go through what all these are, but these are basically the thermometers that determine, is your model healthy? It's sort of like when you get, the results of lab work, and it shows, where, if your lab tests are where they want to be. Our studies are just nailing all of them. We have great model fit. Why is that important? Well, if we're getting it wrong, if reality looked like this, not like this, if we had a bad fitting model, then we could be unfairly tainting those who are critical of Israel, and that we're suppressing appropriate criticism of Israel. And the true nature of anti-Israel was not being discovered. We would be doing harm if we did not have a model that was fitting the data well. But we do have a good fitting model, and that is showing that extreme anti-Israelism, just as the IRA definition suggests, can be a valid signal of anti-Semitism. Extreme anti-Israelism might mask anti-Semitism, and the ancient world of conspiracies has a modern relevance. So because our model is showing the signs that it is a strong, good model, we have good reason to believe the outcomes that I've just described. Okay, one other statistical quality I want to describe, which is something called variance explained. Variance explained is basically how much does variable 1 account for variable 2. In our case, we want to know how much is anti-Semitism filtered through conspiracies explaining anti-Israel attitudes. So imagine we had a new vintage called Chateau Anti-Israel. How much of that bottle is filled with anti-Israel attitudes? 55%. That's a lot. In social sciences, that's a big deal. There's a lot that's not explained by anti-Semitism. 45%, calling that varietal. But this is a substantial chunk. So it's not simply that we get statistical significance, we get something which is showing a large amount of explained variance. Okay, so I'm going to guess that for a lot of you, knowing that or being the idea that there's a connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attitudes is not a shocker. But as I started the talk, this is a contentious topic. There are a lot of credible sources that are saying there is no connection and that the connection is actually being militarized. It's being used to silence critics of Israel, and it's inappropriate to make the claim that the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attitudes are connected. Well, our data show that they are connected, and to a substantial degree. Another point that the research relates to is there is controversy about how one should define anti-Semitism. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance (IRA) definition includes exceeding extreme and biased criticism of Israel. The Jerusalem definition markedly excludes any mention of Israel. There's a lot of controversy. Should the IRA definition be used generally? Well, our data suggests that it's appropriate. DEI policy and programming. A lot of us have had some frustrating experiences with DEI offices who don't recognize that events that are targeting Israel and that also lead to anti-Semitic events are something are qualify as a form of prejudice that they should be addressing. A lot of times think that Jews don't qualify as targets of prejudice because we are supposedly white. So our data hopefully can help inform DEI offices. And then there's concern now about the degree to which an anti-Israel political agenda, which is becoming more common and more popular, does it represent something that looks like that could be an anti-Semitic threat? So even if a politician disavows any anti-Semitism, their energetic broadcasting of their anti-Israel beliefs can represent an anti-Semitic threat. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now with a very kind of quick new area of research I'm looking at, which is what is explaining the 45% of anti-Israelism that's not related to anti-Semitism. And one clue came that I got was during the anti-Israel protests on my campus. I was walking to my building, Smith Hall at Rutgers-Newark, and there was a number of students who were chalking from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is not Smith Hall, by the way, but that's just so you get the message. So I asked them, I said, look, guys, you don't mind my asking, but do you know what it means that from the river to the sea, that's all of Israel? No, this one guy says that's just Gaza. And I go, no. We're talking from the western boundary of all the way to the Mediterranean. He goes, are you sure? Well, yeah, no, I'm pretty sure. I know where the river is. So if this is the case, then the hostility isn't coming from malice. It's coming from just not knowing. So I created a test called the Near East Aptitude Test, and I did an initial study with Rutgers students last spring. So one of the questions is, from the river to the sea refers to what river, what sea? So a little over 50% got it right. Jordan River, Mediterranean. But nearly half had no idea. A lot of them thought it had to do with the Jerusalem River. Any of you been to the Jerusalem River? Have you canoed the Jerusalem River? Have you body surfed the Jerusalem River? Unlikely because it doesn't exist. Or it refers to the Nile and the Mediterranean, or my favorite, the Jerusalem River and the Sargasso Sea, which is off the banks of the Carolinas. Okay, point being is many just don't know. Nakba is Arabic for disaster. It refers to, well, The plurality understood refers to the creation of Israel in 1948. Good numbers thought it had to do with a murder of someone commit of Palestinians, 20,000 Palestinians in 1956. Never happened. Forced conversion of Palestinians to Judaism in 1967. Never happened. Mosque of Omar, you can see it today. They thought it was destroyed. The assassination of Arafat in 1970. Point is that there's just, not only is there ignorance, but there's belief in things which are really malign. Then finally, I created a true false portion um, of the Near East aptitude test that contain both true statements and false statements. So here's the test questions. The correct response for some of them is true, some of them is false. This is the percent correct. And so for a lot of the subjects, they got a lot of these true. I mean, some cases it was a bit of a squeaker. Yasser Arafat practiced nonviolence per Martin Luther King. Most of them knew it was false, but just barely. Okay. But then there are other items where they got it markedly, shockingly wrong. Israel won the 1948 War of Independence because of USA military support. The US had an embargo against arms. 67% think Israel came into being because America gave the arms to do so. Did Israel offer 95% of the West Bank, all of Gaza, for peace? This is true. 68% got that wrong. They said it was false. Israel seeks to spread Judaism through the Middle East by force. 52% thought that was correct. Zionism is Hebrew for conquest as commanded by God. False. 54% thought that was correct. The 1948 war occurred because Jews refused to share any land. Israel signed the partition plan. 69% did not recognize that that's a false statement. Israel's Arab citizens cannot hold political office. That's false. 61% thought it was true. Bill Clinton blamed the failed Camp David peace effort on Israel. That's false. He blamed it on Arafat. 58% got that one wrong. So if many of our young people are seeing Israel in this negative and false light, that they're seeing it as it's it came into being because of American support. It has this bizarre religious conversion agenda. It is discriminating against its own people. If that is how they understand Israel, it's not surprising they don't like Israel. But there's a silver lining if this is a problem of misinformation. It's very hard to change. Psychologists know this. It's very, very hard to change people's feelings. But you can change their thinking. Facts are mutable or can be corrected. And so if that's the case, we now have a way in which we can help address at least a lot of the hostility towards Israel, and especially amongst young people. Okay, well, that concludes my talk. I want to thank all my collaborators, Dominika Bolska, Tom Malloy, Valeria Villa, and the Academic Engagement Network who supported it, and JFAS for inviting me and all of you for attending. So thank you very much.